I don't think education at any level, whether primary, secondary, tertiary, should be denominational. You shouldn't have any kind of religious or indeed political affiliation. Education is about teaching people how to think and giving them materials for doing some thinking for themselves. It's not about telling them what to think. And no matter how pious people are about saying, oh well, in our sectarian schools we don't try to inculcate a certain set of beliefs, nevertheless these things do happen. And the whole tenor of a faith-based education is implicit in the very idea that there is a faith basis to that education. So I think one of the great things that needs to be done in our world in general, but in Scotland and the rest of the UK now, is to try to separate education from any kind of sectarian attachment. Secularism to me means that there is a sharp division between those organisations which are after all self-interest lobby groups who have a faith outlook on the one hand, and on the other hand anything to do with public policy matters, education, scientific research. What we need is a public square in which all voices, including religious voices, have a right to have their say, but their right to have their say should be to some extent proportional to the actual constituency they represent. I'm talking in UK terms, it may be slightly different in Scotland, but in UK terms, something less than 10% of the population are regular weekly attenders at a mosque or a synagogue or a church or a temple. And yet, religious organisations are given an enormously inflated footprint in the public square. They're given an opportunity to get to the top table, to get to the front of the queue, to be taken notice of by government. In fact, in England, there is an established church. And the result of that is sometimes unobvious to people because it's so much the wallpaper of social and political life in England that people don't notice it. In the rest of the UK, it's not quite the same. But still, secularism means a very sharp separation between all those organisations which have special interests and the general interest which has to be served for the community as a whole. Personally, I think secularism is good for religion. I mean, after all, secularism was an idea developed by the church back in medieval times. The church didn't want the temporal powers interfering in its business. In fact, there was a very asymmetric relationship because the church continued to interfere with the temporal powers on a pretty consistent basis. But they didn't want the temporal powers telling them who they could appoint as bishops and priests and how to run their affairs. And even indeed, people remember the concept of benefit of clergy, that even if you were in lay orders, you could be exempted from the exercise of civil power. You could be tried in an ecclesiastical court instead. And a residuum of that we've seen in our own day, tragically, with the Roman Catholic Church thinking that it can make decisions about people who have committed very serious crimes of paedophilia, for example, protect those people from the civil authorities, move them away even to other places where they can repeat their crimes. And now that this has become public, we see how it is that we simply cannot have, in a civic order, we cannot have people trying to overlay their own laws, their own courts. I mean, this is the problem that rises with Sharia now in many Western countries too. Makes it all the more urgent that we think seriously about what secularism means. I had the great honour earlier this year of addressing the Scottish Parliament on its sort of thought for the day opening session, and I'm delighted by the fact that in this part of these islands anyway, more voices than just religious voices can be heard in those sorts of settings. But actually, it shouldn't really be about whether it's a religious voice or a non-religious voice. It should be voices. There should be people who have a point to make, an argument to offer, a take, a perspective on things. Because our government, certainly our parliament certainly, should be open to hearing people who have thought a little bit about things, offering them something, offering them an idea, a reflection, something that might be a little bit of grist for the mill of more general political debate. I think it is quite wrong that in our schools, and as a matter of law, children, even those of no religious commitment or have atheist parents, should be obliged to take part in any kind of religious ceremony or service, or to be asked to utter prayers of one or another religion or sing their songs. This is an imposition. Actually, it's a form of abuse of a civil liberty. People ought to be able to say at school, I don't want to be part of that, and I could use that time much more fruitfully reading science, let's say. I was very surprised to learn that every local authority in Scotland on its education board has to have 3 appointees, unelected appointees, who have a religious affiliation and a full vote on that board. Now this is going to skew things. We just need to look across the Atlantic and look at what's happened again and again and again in those states, especially in the south of the United States of America, where school boards have attempted to introduce, for example, creationism into biology lessons, and the expensive and very conflictual matter of legal proceedings against them to protect children against over-influence from religion has been the result. In every case, I have to say, the secular argument has won the day so far, which is good news. But why exhaust ourselves? Why waste time and resources doing that? Let's get back to the fundamentals about education, which is, this is about helping people to think, giving them the equipment to think, encouraging them, indeed challenging them to think, not telling them what to think, and not trying to skew things in a certain direction, in the vain hope, mistaken hope by the way, that if there's a little bit of religion in the curriculum, it's going to make everybody behave themselves. The debate about secularism has now become irreversible, and it is revealing an enormous amount about all sorts of countries. I mean, for example, recently I was in Australia, and I was surprised to learn how much influence the Roman Catholic Church has in Australia, just for example. When you look at Ireland, and you look at Northern Ireland, you look at the sectarian divisions, which have been a source of really serious, bloody conflict in that country, you realise it really is time for us to grow up now and to start thinking about just how much of a place the religious voice ought to be allocated. And the answer to that, I think, is a place proportional to their real support in our society, which, especially in advanced societies, is less and less. I should mention also, by the way, that we look at the tragedies unfolding in the Muslim majority countries in the world. And this is the result of a tremendous fracture within Muslim societies themselves under the impact of secularism coming at them from outside. We think to ourselves, how can it be that these are matters that can result in the untimely deaths of so many people, when quiet, calm, rational debate would say, okay, everybody's entitled to their view, but let's not try and force our view on other people. And this, of course, is what's happening everywhere. It concerns me greatly that Sharia courts are now fully operational, in fact, in many parts of the UK. Now, this is the result of actually rather benevolent attitude, which is, let's try to be inclusive, let's be multicultural, let's respect all the different traditions and outlooks of people who come to live together in these islands. And so, there are Jewish courts down in London, right next door to one of the major theatres. There's the Church of Scotland, ecclesiastical court for Scots living down there. So this is an attempt to be inclusive, but in fact it's very divisive, and in fact it drives underground a very great deal of injustice. One example, many wives are brought to the United Kingdom from their home countries, don't speak English, they don't know about the law in the UK, they don't know that they have a remedy at law if something goes wrong. They can be divorced, they can lose their children, they can lose their dowries, and all this happens sub rosa, under the cloak of a Sharia court. And this is absolutely wrong. I think if people come to the United Kingdom, or to any part of the United Kingdom, England or Scotland, part of what they should do is to be prepared to sign up to some of the fundamentals. And one of the fundamentals is equality before the law, access to remedy at law, not to be swept away into a little corner without knowing what their options are. I'm actually much more optimistic than a lot of people about what's happening with the great debate between religion and those who don't have a religion. Yes, indeed, there are many secular organizations, humanist organizations, atheist organizations are rising. And this, I think, is a function of two things. Firstly, religious organizations can organize themselves and act as a single body. And this we've seen in the United States, for example. There is something like 60 million or so self-declared right-wing evangelicals in the United States. They have radio stations, television stations, a lot of money, big mega churches, big lobbying, powerful and well-organized lobbying organizations in Washington. People who don't have a religious outlook are equal to one person, because they don't meet up and they don't bond together into bodies. But this is changing now. Now people are beginning to get together. And the fact that there are so many different organizations, there's the secular people, the atheist people, the rationalists, the skeptics, the humanists, is in itself a very good sign, because there should be more voices. If they all got into one, they've got one voice. So lots of different voices is a good thing. And they represent lots of different shades of opinion about things among those who don't have a religious commitment, and that's a good thing also. But the best thing about it is that they're speaking out. I was very, very struck as I went to the American Atheist Convention in Austin in Texas earlier this year, and I was tremendously heartened. This is a very, very big convention, over 1,000 people there from all over the United States. And what they had done was they had adopted the technique of the gay movement. The gay movement said, we're gay, we're out, and we're proud, and we're going to announce the fact that we have these views. And by doing it, this tiny minority really in a society has utterly transformed perceptions about homosexuality and about the right of people to their sexuality. And I think now that atheists are saying, I'm atheist, I'm out, and I'm proud, in the United States, where there are still many penalties for being so, is an absolute game changer. And we'll see, I think, in the next decade or so, a real movement there. And I might add also, by the way, that what looks like a resurgence of religion in the world is not. It's actually the volume being turned up by people who feel that they're in a corner. If you get an animal into a corner, it'll make a lot more noise and it'll be a lot more frightened. And so I don't think that we're seeing religion on the rise. I think we're seeing it on the back foot. And the reason why it's so present in debate and is making such a lot of noise is precisely because it feels under threat. Christians among them are, especially in more peaceful, advanced Western countries, are not entirely unhappy about this, because they like a little bit of persecution. My name is AC Grayling, and I support Edinburgh Secular Society very strongly.